Evaluation forms I will pick up later, so after the adjudicating and everything. Also, I'm going to need one of the judges to just tell me when I can invite the next speaker. Okay, thank you. Please turn off your mobile phone. Thank you. So the motion for this round reads: this House believes that states should allow all non-citizen migrant workers to vote in local and national elections. Debating this round are Team Armenia who are proposing and Team USA who are opposing. So please welcome all the speakers. The adjudicators for this round are Dora from Croatia, Dennis from Taiwan, and Theodore from Greece. Each speaker has 8 minutes to deliver their speech. At the end of the speech will be marked by a double knock. The first and the 7 minutes are protected from points of information and will be marked by 1 knock. The first or the second speaker of each side will deliver a 4-minute reply speech for their side. There are no points of information during the reply speeches. I would like to invite the first speaker to deliver their speech.
Panel, ladies and gentlemen. Immigrant workers in all countries live in a dictatorship known as no alternatives, right? They're living in a dictatorship that tells them that they have to work and work they have to work in a country that does not cater for their needs, right? In this debate, we're going to base our arguments and our case on the idea of democracy as a whole, right? What is the idea of democracy and where does it come from? Right? Democracy comes from the idea that all people living in a society should be represented by institutions that have a desire to control the system that they're living in, right? So these people, these people must always be represented by these people, because if they are represented, then you fulfill what democracy needs to do, right? And we see that in democracies, there's an existing political spectrum, right? You always have politicians deciding to do things. And who dictates this spectrum is the voters themselves, right? They're going to see who is the voter. They're going to see who is in the demographic of the voter, and therefore decide their policies upon this fact. Therefore, the demographic of the voters dictates what the politics of a country does, right? So, in simple, the politics of any country is dictated by the demographic of all the people existing in this country. Now, what does this do in the status quo? It provides politicians with an incentive to cater for the highest number of people that they can, right? Which means they broaden their approaches. They are going to go to people that are minorities. For example, in the USA, for example, in countries like the USA, when politicians are running, they're also going to cater for the minorities. They're going to cater for the people that are infringed of their rights, because they feel that this is where their voter basis comes from, right? So this incentive is good for people, because when people are the target of politics in a country, they're going to be benefited when they cry for what they need in a country. Now, what is our model in our debate, right? We want to see that immigrant workers are going to be able to vote. What does the government have to do? The government has to have a better grapple on the knowledge of the existing migrant workers, right? So those existing migrant workers must be registered in some form of ID so that they can vote, right? Now we see that they are also illegal immigrants. Now if they do not vote, that's not a problem that we are going to solve on the side proposition. But we say that if they have the will to vote, they must also vote, because they have a say in the society that they are living in, right? What is our burden in this debate? Our burden is that we're going to show you that on side proposition, we have the only option that makes sure that the immigrant workers that would have been underrepresented, that would be under-participating in the politics of a country, will now be represented, and this will prove beneficial to the status quo. Now, let's give you two substantives in this argument. I'm going to give you a principal argument on why everyone deserves to have a voice in a democracy, and the second argument is why we're going to exacerbate the harms that are happening to the vulnerable immigrant workers in today's society, right? So, principle. Why does everyone deserve to have a voice in a country? Like we told you, in a democracy, A democracy will only work if everyone has the chance to say something, if everyone has to say on what a democracy should do, right? The politics should always work for the masses, right? And if you increase those masses, if you include people in those masses, then you literally have something good for them. They are participating in they are participating in the politics of the country. Moreover, we see that they are also, these immigrant workers are participating in the building of the core important things in a country. That is the economy of the country, right? They're coming in with practical benefits, like they work in as skilled labor in developed countries, and in developing countries, they work in to fill jobs that might not have, that don't currently have the skills that they need in those countries, right? Now, how do they contribute economically? When a country takes in immigrant workers, what is the aim of the country? The aim of the country is to complement something in society, right? So they want to fill the jobs that are not being done. For example, in developed countries, they're going to take in a high number of labor force, because that is something that may not exist in many countries. For example, in Croatia, where you have most people that are working in the skilled labor force, you need more people to be working in the semi-skilled and the non-skilled labor force. Therefore, what they're taking in is these people that are going to benefit in the economy and in something that is core to the economy. But moreover, they contribute to something else, that is the culture of the country, right? Some countries bring in migrant workers and bring in people just because they are different, but just because they have a different perspective to offer to that country. And that is something that we see as good on side proposition. Now, yes?
Do you support the right of people to vote in the elections of countries that they do not live in?
Of course not, because these people are living in separate places. They're not currently in this environment that you're talking about. Therefore, I don't see where you're getting at there. Now, to conclude our initial argument, we say that if countries like Zimbabwe are crying out for people that have skilled labor to come into their countries, then they should have a consideration of taking these people in politically as well. Now let's go on to our second argument on how we're going to exacerbate the harms that are being done to the vulnerable people in society today. We see in South Africa, right, there are Zimbabweans and Kenyans living there as migrant workers. We find them vulnerable, and in most times they suffer quite due to things such as racism, xenophobia, and in most of the cases they have no one to turn to, right? Because the system has no incentive to cater for their needs, which is what we're proposing on side proposition, to make sure that the politics of the country caters for everyone. But in these cases that you're not catering for these people, what is happening? The results are very simple. You're going to have targeted crimes towards these people. You're going to have a narrative that is not actively trying to neutralize the phobias that are existing against them, right? Which is something that is bad, because that is something that is to exist. And we say that on side proposition, even if their voting does not result in them succeeding, it is still justified for someone to do something in the case that they want to succeed, even if they do not have the chances of succeeding in the final place, right? We see that in the status quo, right, for migrant workers, more things are happening. You have institutional racism towards these people if they happen to be racial minorities in these countries, which is something that they can vote for in the politics, which is something that they can cry for in the politics of the country, in the politics of the countries. Moreover, it happens locally, right? When they say something to the local officials, it actually resonates to the rest of the country. It actually resonates to the whole demographic of the country. Therefore, if the country cares enough about these people, they're going to focus on these people, right? You're going to eliminate the bad working laws that are existing in South Africa today for Zimbabwean workers, because they're forced to work hours and hours and hours, but they have no one to say that someone is harming them. Therefore, we feel that on side proposition, everyone has to have someone that can approach in the system. For this, we propose.
Thank you. I would like to invite the first speaker of the set of
Side proposition very rightly points out that there are many problems with anti-immigrant sentiment. We live in a world where xenophobia floods the streets, where people like Donald Trump point at immigrants as criminals and rapists only in a country to steal our jobs and influence our policy against our interest. On side proposition, they stand for a policy that only fuels these narratives and allows politicians and xenophobes like Donald Trump to point at immigrants and say, not only are they stealing our jobs and taking over our economy, they're also taking over our country. We think that their policy actually overwhelmingly harms migrants, and even if migrants did meet the conditions necessary for voting, which we do not think they do, we would still fail this policy because we think that it would overwhelmingly harm migrants. Before I introduce rebuttals to some of Proposition's material and introduce our first two substantive arguments, I'd just like to clarify a couple of things in this round. First, what exactly do migrant workers look like? We think that, as side proposition pointed out, they are workers in a country pretty much exclusively there to get a job and send money either to themselves or back to their families. That's the primary purpose they're there. The second thing we think is overwhelmingly true of migrant workers is that they're there temporarily. Usually it's things like seasonal workers that are just there to, say, work in agriculture for one season, or they're there for a couple of years. But the visa or green card that they're on eventually expires and they do return home to their original country. Migrant workers are, generally speaking, temporary. With that, let's introduce some responses to the material they brought to you. Their first argument was about how representation is democratically good, and then second, they talked about how this benefits migrants. Let's start with the first. We have three responses. First, let's just clarify that this is not a dictatorship where migrants have no alternatives. They have generally chosen to move to a country in order to work there, and are not in fact there to serve that country, but are rather there to make money for themselves or to send back to their family. Second, we think that they have to meet certain conditions, as we'll explain in our first argument, in order to earn the right to vote in a country, rather than just living there in the first place. We don't think that working in a country necessarily means that you suddenly earn the right to vote in it. Just as if an electrician, per se, comes to my house and does work on my house, we don't think that electrician has the right to, say, influence the policy in my house, because they weren't doing that to help me. It was generally a mutually beneficial relationship. Third and finally, they make a critical assumption that assumes that all migrant workers are in a country long term and are in fact going to be affected by the policies that they are voting for. This is overwhelmingly, as we tell you in framing, not true. We'll explain why this is so harmful as well in our first argument. But their second argument was about how we harm migrants on our side of the house. We actually think that the opposite is true. First, this argument assumes that migrant workers are going to make up a large enough section of the population to actually be able to implement change. We think particularly in xenophobic countries that are already anti-immigrant, this is very unlikely to be true at the point where they're already restricting immigration policy and the like. But second, we tell you that politicians are unlikely to cater to people who are going to just be there temporarily, and are more likely just to cater to the large majority of the rest of the population that makes up a larger part of the population and is also there in the long term. And finally, as we'll tell you in our second argument, it is actually more likely to increase backlash against these migrant workers and harm their plight even further at the point where you perpetuate harmful narratives. With that, let's introduce our first argument about how non-citizen migrant workers don't meet the principal conditions necessary to have the right to vote. What do we think that these conditions are? First, we think that in order to dictate the policy of a government and the community around you, you have to make certain contributions to that society. And second, you have to have a direct stake in the vote that you're casting, so there's some accountability. Non-citizen migrant workers meet neither of these conditions. First, non-citizens ought not vote. What is unique, particularly about citizens? We think they give up substantial and unique rights to the government in exchange for protection and a voice in that government. This looks like paying taxes, adhering to laws, doing things like serving on juries, and even doing military service, where the government asks you literally to put your life on the line for your country. Those last two are particularly and uniquely true of citizens. And note that all citizens do this in the long term, generally their whole life. Governments put these expectations uniquely on citizens, which is why, in most cases, we recognize that governments have a unique obligation to those citizens that are doing the most for them. This is why we think it is incredibly unfair for individuals who are not satisfying those types of burdens, namely non-citizens, to have a disproportionate influence in elections. But second, we tell you temporary workers not there for a long-term stake in an election ought not be able to vote.
Ma'am.
We told you that these visas are typically temporary, they expire, and workers go back to their country. In some cases, in seasonal workers, literally just after a couple of months, which means they're not accountable to the decision that they make. We think not only are you making a choice for yourself, but also for your community, you ought to be accountable for the consequences of that choice. Just as we would not support the right of people outside a country to vote in those elections, we don't think that temporary workers ought to do so either. With that, let's introduce our second argument, but before that, I'll take a point.
Ma'am, if you say that these workers are temporary, don't you believe that there are also going to be other workers that are going to come after them? Therefore, their voting will help those workers that come after them.
Look, we think that when I'm voting in an election, I might be voting theoretically in my own interest, but if I'm not there to be directly accountable to that decision, even if I'm nominally maybe voting for somebody else, we don't think that that is right. Even if someone in another country is maybe theoretically designed to vote in the interest of the people in that country, because they're not accountable to that decision, we don't support that right. Our second argument is that this actually worsens the plight of non-citizen migrants. We tell you this is especially true if they do things like support the rights of illegal immigrants to vote. The places where migrant policies need to improve the most, which is what they're talking about on their side, are the places where anti-immigrant sentiment is already really high. This is the United States under Trump, France under the influence of people like Marine Le Pen, who tell you that, and in these countries, two things are true. First, the number of migrant workers, because of this anti-immigrant sentiment, is relatively low. But second, people are very receptive to ideas that migrants are bad and seriously harmful. This is specifically true for temporary migrant workers. What are these criticisms here? It looks like three things. First, criticisms look like people literally criticizing these migrants as coming into these countries, taking jobs and resources away from individuals like people in the Rust Belt who feel really victimized. That is literally the reason that migrant workers come to countries. Second, it does look like racial bias and xenophobia that they talk about on their side of the house, where migrants are criminalized as rapists and drug dealers and things like that. This is especially true of low-skilled workers. Third and finally, at least there is this perception that these immigrants aren't contributing, again, back to the society that they are living in and benefiting from as workers who are earning a wage and things like this. What do all of these things have in common? It looks like people believing that migrants are freeloaders and individuals who are not to be trusted. And politicians capitalize on that sentiment. This looks like things like the Muslim ban being passed and visa restrictions in Germany and Hungary under Orban. How does granting voting rights to these immigrants affect this? First, it means that politicians are going to weaponize and demonize these individuals even more. We don't trust these individuals to come into our country and take our jobs, but now, in addition to that, they're going to be voting in elections. And in a world where migrants are overwhelmingly characterized as criminals, it is likely that things like caps on how many workers can come into a country to do things like work to feed their family are going to go down. If they want to protect migrants, they'll do things to actually benefit them, not give them an empty ballot that's just going to lead to more harm. So proud to oppose.
when a Mexican migrant moves to the US because it has no alternative in the local environment, because of the drug cartels, because of the poverty, because of the local neglection of the government, we think that it's moving from no alternative with a hope of having a better life to the US. And then it faces the raw reality where it has no other alternative, and it's exactly the same dictatorship where it's coming from. And that's the major characterization flaw that the US has presented in this debate, in which this is people that are voluntarily choosing to go into these countries, are neglecting those minorities that are forced to enter these states, fighting, looking for a better life, and hence have no other choice than moving to these countries. So what will happen during this speech? First, we'll rebuttal whatever they've said throughout this debate, then we'll enter a reconstruction in which we strengthen our arguments based on what they presented, and third, our third substantive point, which clashes directly on how is the status quo facilitating populism. So first of all, when they address our first argument on why, in principle, this is people that should not have the right, they're not directly engaged with the local environment of politics, and why hence our principle of why they should have a vote is not standing. No, thank you. Well, first of all, the major flaw in their characterization is also how they think that this is people that reside exclusively for short term, and we think that this is simply not true, because this is people that are escaping conflict areas and then they're entering these societies. They build the foundations of their life in this country and hence have no incentive to leave these places because they have built on are not only afraid of coming back to their home environment, which is hostile, but second, because they're winning the money that is sustaining their families, so they fear that their families will not be sustained if they have to come back. And third, they fear reputation. Yes, first.
How are politicians like Donald Trump going to react to the fact that now migrant working populations are able to vote?
Thank you. And this will clash directly with our third substantive, but what I can tell you thus far is that with the votes of these people, we can directly counter the policies and the politicians that benefit from the votes, right? Because when you have no vote incentive to cater to these minorities, then you can simply completely neglect them, exclude them from any agenda. And when they're excluded from any agenda, this is when you have no representation, and hence there is a bigger problem because they can't defend themselves in any way. No, thank you. Now, the way in which they also try to attack our first argument is how they were trying to tell us that this is people that are not directly contributing to these local communities, to these environments. And only when there's this moral reciprocity, this giving back and taking back, is when you can have a right to vote, which is what they try to sell to us in their first argument. And why we think that this is not true is because this is people that are giving, however they're taking nothing. They have no protection in the legal system, they have no representation in the democratic system, and in their local communities they fail hostility. No, thank you. And this is something that we feel is completely excluding them, completely disenfranchising them, and when they have no way of taking from the government something, or at least trying to engage somehow, we think that this is already a problem. This is when it comes to illegal workers. But when it comes to legal workers, we think that these migrants are A, paying a tax, second, they have to pay their paperwork, their bureaucratic process to enter the country, so they're directly contributing. And when they're sustaining the economy, when they're doing jobs that no one else wants to do, then we think that this is how these people are contributing directly and hence have the right to take. Yes?
Does representation mean anything if you cannot actually implement actual change?
It doesn't, but we'll tell you very simply how it does entail change, because now when you have the vote incentive to include them in your agenda, then as simple as that, policies are also catering to their needs. Because if you have no incentive otherwise to cater to their needs, there won't be any single change. But when you can get these votes, when you can win elections by a small margin, when you're getting the votes of a minority, then it is in this case in which you can create a change in the democratic system. So this is why we understand that our first argument still stands. No, thank you. Now, when it comes to their second argument, why these people who have immunity are being very vulnerable, and we think that because they have no representation, there's no incentive to include them into the legal system, and we think that this is highly problematic because then it allows for gerrymandering, it allows for a hostile rhetoric, it allows for abuses without any giving immunity to whoever is abusing, and this is completely flawed. We think that this is this is already demoralizing, this is dehumanizing. So this is why we think that there's a need for the representation to be able to be conveyed in votes and hence change these systemic flaws. No, thank you. So now, this is why a second big trouble with how they approach our second argument is that they think that this is a burden for the population, and if we vote for them, then there's a change in the short term that doesn't benefit those permanent residents. First of all, we understand that most people that enter countries, developed countries, when looking for better opportunities, will reside in these places for a long period of time. We think of Somalis deported from the US last year who have to spend 27 years of their life there. There's even people who never resided in Somalia, and yet they were being deported, never had a chance to be included in the political system. This is highly problematic. This is not how democracy, not how any state should work, nothing. So now, this is why I think that our case is still standing, how their principles are fundamentally flawed. So now let's enter our substantive. No, thank you. How this facilitates progress. We think that in any democratic system, what a party benefits from is votes. Because when you have votes, you can access political power. And there's a simple cycle that we understand is that political power attracts money, money attracts political power, and hence you have more visibility, you have more access to spread your rhetoric, right? So not only, and the way in which you understand this happens in most Western democracies, which is where most of the migrants reside, is that it's fully imbalanced. The discourse regarding minorities is completely against the side of minorities. And in the best case scenario, a single party will target them while the others not, but still this party is highly appealing to the society because it's exploiting their insecurities. No, thank you. So now, how will this change on our side? How proposing the motion solves or alleviates this issue? First of all, we think that this happens in a direct manner. Because not as many votes will end up going to these politicians because there's direct minorities, direct representation groups that fight these parties. No, thank you. So we think that when you're taking votes directly, it is in these cases in which you're directly taking power from these parties, right? And the other way in which this happens is indirectly. Because we think that better policies are proposed. We're moving from a democratic system that bases its rhetoric on whether or supporting a minority or not, from one in which the policies are much more important. And why we think this happens? How does it actually happen? Because now you have more people to cater the needs of, which is the minorities, which is people that were before fully excluded from the political system. So once these are included, then you have more needs and more interests. So you have to make better policies that we end up valuing overall, because this is the way in which we can ensure long-term prosperity of any state, instead of having short-term, passion-driven policies that are hindering democratic systems in the US, in Latin America, in Europe, all around the world. So this is why we think that by proposing the motion, we deter populism. And this is very important because ultimately we're ensuring that the pillars of democracy are being respected, that the demoralization that is happening upon minorities is deterred, is alleviated, and ultimately you enfranchise people that have no alternative, living on a dictatorship, which is something we highly oppose. So this is why we propose the motion. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to invite the second speaker of the opposition to deliver their speech.
In her first speech, Ella tells you that the biggest obstacle to having pro-immigrant policy is xenophobia. They never once engage with the very critical material that we told you about how actually in their world, whenever you allow worker migrants to vote, we think this actually gets worse and it creates more obstacles that are actually going to harm a very small voting group. They concede in a point of information that if representation does not lead to change, then it is irrelevant. We think at that point they are already very behind in today's debate. In this speech, I'm going to be doing a couple of things. First, I'm going to be addressing all of the material we've heard so far coming out of the proposition, and then going to be delivering our third substantive argument, taking them on their highest ground, talking about how enabling migrant workers to vote perpetuates political interference. But now let's get into the material that we heard coming out of the first proposition and second proposition speakers under two questions. The first is, do migrant workers principally have a right to vote? The only response that we heard on our first argument was that migrants won't move to these certain countries. We don't think that was enough of a response. Rather, the only reason proposition gives you for why everyone must be valued in a democracy is participation. If participation is the qualification they're going to give us for voting, we think that is the reason that migrant workers ought not to be allowed to vote. Why is this the case? We told you that existing citizens surrender more of their rights and thus participate more than migrants. For example, unlike migrant workers, all citizens pay tax, are subject to a draft and in some cases compulsory military service, and have specific obligations to fulfill as citizens, like jury duty, for example. We think that in that case, only citizens meet their own conditions. So participation is the qualification for voting. That's a reason to oppose. But now let's take them on their highest ground. Why is contributing to a country's economy not enough to warrant a right for migrant workers to vote, even if they do things like pay tax and actually benefit economic development? We think in order to achieve the benefits of any policy, the migrant workers casting a vote have to stay in that country long enough to see a policy is enacted. We get a pretty false characterization of what migrant workers actually look like from their side of the house. Note that they never once actually engage with what happens if migrant workers return back to their homes, in which case we don't think that policy is actually going to affect them and simply will affect all of the original citizens involved. Because of their lack of comparative, we think there is a pretty big problem. We can support existing paths to citizenship, for example, that actually can help long-term migrants consistent with the will of the people. But now, let's get into the second main question in this debate, which we think is a lot of the offense that we see from both sides of the House. Will politicians cater to immigrants? We think the answer is pretty clearly no. Note that every single one of their impacts on voting relies on this question. It relies on leading to change. And in a point of information, they agree that is what is at the core of today's round. But now let's do some analysis as to why this doesn't happen on their side of the House. This also engages with their third substantive argument, which is pretty similar to their second argument about making populism worse. We would say, first off, let's just do some basic number analysis here. In most countries, the number of actual immigrant workers that are in those countries are pretty small. In the US, it's less than 1 million. We think that from a quantity standpoint alone, we still think that politicians don't have a reason to cater to migrants. Because in a democracy, the majority wins, meaning that just from that standpoint of numbers, they don't have a reason to specifically cater to these migrant groups, meaning their impact does not happen. The second reason why we think it's unlikely to see this impact happen is because of the issue of sustainability. Note that once again, in the short-term voting base, it's not going to be prioritized in a world where politicians are long-termist thinking. They're going to want to do things, for example, like prioritize voting groups that are going to stay in that country. In the vast majority of cases, this will not happen with migrant workers. They have to engage on the comparative. But now, note that they essentially concede our backlash argument. Look to their own example of a Mexican migrant to the US. Politicians in power who are anti-immigrant have a specific vested interest in then restricting the number of migrant workers, because if they continue to allow immigration, the migrant workers will simply vote against them. In that case, politicians that are already in power, for example Donald Trump, have a vested interest in decreasing visas for workers and actually narrowing avenues for migrant workers to travel to different countries. Why is this so important? We tell you what happens for a couple of reasons. First off, when politicians have a vested interest in narrowing the amount of migrant workers, none of their benefits happen. But the second reason why we tell you this is important is because this is exceedingly likely, considering that a lot of other individuals have a lot of backlash to migrant populations already in the status quo because of simply things like quote-unquote taking other people's jobs. We think that insofar as that is the case, if now you're granting the right to vote to a lot of different migrant workers, backlash against those same workers only increases. There is no benefit that we actually see coming from this, meaning there is absolutely no reason to propose at this point in the debate. But now let's get into our third substantive argument, which is going to take them on their highest ground. Before I do that, I'll take a point.
If populism in people like Donald Trump is going to be incited, don't you think that policies that target migrant workers are also going to be incited in their opposition, for example, Hillary Clinton?
No. Populism thrives off of the ability to pinpoint migrant workers and claim that they have more, claim that they threaten the majority. Insofar as that is the case, now if you're literally allowing migrant workers to actually vote, we think you're only giving more fodder and more power for those same politicians to spew more discriminatory rhetoric, populism. Their third substantive argument gets worse on their side of the house. But now let's get into our third substantive argument. Our second argument, as Ella already said, talks about countries with high amounts of anti-immigrant sentiment. This argument is more encompassing because it talks about countries that don't have a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment and are especially vulnerable to political coercion from other countries. Note that this argument takes them on their highest ground, assuming migrants can vote, that policies are enacted in favor of them, and there is little backlash. We still see overwhelming harms. Our third substantive argument is that enabling migrant workers to vote perpetuates political interference. Why is this the case? We think that this argument encompasses countries where foreign influence that in many cases contradicts a level of the will of people is high. This looks like high levels of Chinese investment in Egypt or Zimbabwe, or Russian interference in Ukraine, for example. These countries are already dependent on foreign powers for military and economic reasons. In these cases, citizens being able to actively make voting decisions on their own domestic policy is especially significant to be removed and isolated from foreign coercion. What does this look like? We think it looks like, for example, Egypt passing a law that guarantees 9 domestic workers must work for every 1 foreign Chinese worker, for example, due to an infrastructural investment that was not actually hiring Egyptian citizens. We think, in fact, especially whenever influence from global powers will probably happen to a level on both sides of the house, the only mechanism to represent a citizen's will is through voting, especially in these cases of actual combating foreign coercion. The opposition defends this mechanism, but how does enabling migrant workers to vote create interference in things like elections? Countries that have an active, vested interest in shaping domestic policy will abuse this mechanism for their own benefit. We don't think this is actually an externality. Rather, Russia, for example, has already flooded countries like the Balkan states, i.e. Montenegro, Kosovo, and Ukraine, with pro-Russian citizens to eventually attain citizenship and actually craft policy. In these cases, we think the impact is that actors like China investing in nations within Africa, for example, have a vested interest in increasing their own economic profit for things like their businesses by, for example, blocking policies that limit foreign workers, raising the minimum wage, preventing resource extraction, or implementing safety regulations. The reason why they have an incentive to do all of this is because all of these different mechanisms would then decrease the profit of Chinese companies. If they can then simply send in a lot of foreign migrant workers to then change their domestic policy, we think it's highly likely they're going to take advantage of this mechanism. That not only undermines democracy, but we think at the end of the day, that's actually going to impact these countries the most than in comparison to their own marginal benefit. We believe in preserving the most fundamental check against infiltration by foreign influence. We believe in the opposition.
Thank you. I would like to invite the third speaker of the proposition to deliver their speech.
When one member of a society contributes to the economic side of a country, they are socializing, they are helping the community and living under the same condition with the other citizens. We do believe they deserve the same right of the other citizens, which is the right to vote. Because that is when we know that they are part of the society, they are willing to give their life to this society, work in the country, and when we neglect them, it means that we are not giving them protection. Meanwhile, they are the most vulnerable people in that country. Ladies and gentlemen, before moving forward to the conclusion why we should allow this non-citizens migrant workers to vote, let me bring to you two flashpoints in this debate. The first one, let us take a look which sides will bring benefit to the migrant workers, and the second one, let's see whether or not these migrant workers deserve the rights to vote. Moving on to the first one, which side brings benefit to the migrant workers itself? Ladies and gentlemen, team opposition come to us and saying how this politician, in a certain countries, because of xenophobia, will actually attack those migrant workers because they are being given the right to vote. Ladies and gentlemen, we do believe this kind of thing is immediate and temporary. Why do we say so? Because we do believe that when these people are integrated, when these non-citizens migrant workers are integrated into society, you will acknowledge that they are giving back to the community. Hence, slowly but sure, these non-citizens migrant workers will be accepted by the society, hence protection will come. Ladies and gentlemen, we also do believe that we prefer to have people receiving the hate crimes rather than, and they are politically acknowledged, and hence they are being given the protection, rather than they are not protected at all, rather than they are not giving the right at all. Because we do believe when we are giving them the politically acknowledged, when we acknowledge them politically, when we are giving them the right to vote, the protection comes along with them. The protection comes along for these non-citizens migrant workers, which they are not right now. Ladies and gentlemen, we do believe this kind of thing will not happen in the world of the opposition, because when this kind of thing, this politician will keep attacking, hence the xenophobia will actually keep continuing, hence there are no effort to actually stop this kind of thing. Meanwhile, in our world, in the affirmative world, we do believe that this migrant worker will slowly but sure integrate into the society, and we do believe that they will get the protection that they deserve, and hence being counted as part of the society. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we also do see how this team opposition has brought to you a wrong fact about how they are saying that the migrant workers in USA are only less than 1 million. Ladies and gentlemen, we do believe even in the Central America, there's over 50 million migrant workers, which is in Central America. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we do believe that because of this kind of thing, when we're talking about democracy, we're talking about accountability, we're talking about the participation and the representation itself. Hence, if we want this representation, if we want this participation to be represented, these migrant workers to be represented, we should give them the right to vote because they deserve that. Yes.
There are 330 million people that live in the United States, less than 1 million of which are non-citizen migrant workers. Who are politicians more likely to cater to? 330 million people or one?
Ladies and gentlemen, we do believe that, since the beginning, we're giving the right to vote. Now, later or not, whether it will affect the final vote, or later or not, whether it will not affect the final vote, it actually does matter, because we do believe that this kind of thing itself. Now, if this vote will actually affect the final vote or the other things, we do believe that it is good for the migrant workers. But if it's not affecting the final vote, we do believe that the government itself will still give the protection towards these migrant workers, because right now they don't have any protection because they are not politically acknowledged by the society and by the government, right? Hence, if we're giving them now, even if there is a hate crimes, even if they're being oppressed by the society, we do believe the protection, if we're applying this motion, will come along, rather than in their world where the protection itself will not and will never happen, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the second flashpoint, which is about whether or not the migrant workers deserve the right to vote. Now, they keep saying how these migrant workers itself didn't deserve the right to vote just because they don't fulfill the principal condition. Now, what are the conditions? They are saying that the conditions is that they need to contribute. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we do see how this is not true, because some countries actually relies heavily on the migrant workers because it is a mutual benefit, right? It is a mutual benefit for the country and also for the migrant workers. Hence, we want to actually appreciate this benefit benefit that these migrant workers bring to a country. Because we do believe that these migrant workers are working in certain countries. They are working. They are willing to giving their life to us to the country to benefit the country. They wanted to. They actually are making the benefit towards the economy of the country, and we think it is wrong to say that they are not contributing to the country. Indeed, they are contributing to the country economically and also socially, ladies and gentlemen, because they are part of the society. They are contributing to the nation's income. They are contributing to the community. They are contributing to the society. Hence, we do believe this is the contribution that we should appreciate, and this is the contribution that we need to give back to them. And hence, we do believe that this is why these migrant workers deserve the right to vote. Now, moving on. Yes.
I gave you 3 reasons why politicians won't cater to migrant workers. Voting won't create change, but it will create more repression of migrants in the first place and violence against them.
Ladies and gentlemen, again and again we have told you that even when these people having a hate crimes, even if they are oppressed in the society because of this right to vote, we do believe that it is a mutual benefit for them, because there will come protection. They will be protected because of what? Because they are politically acknowledged, right? Because they are politically acknowledged by the government. Hence, the protection will come along. Don't be afraid that there will be actually being oppressed more, because we believe it is not true. Hence, we do believe that because they are protected, because they have this right to vote, that will come along with the protection itself. We do believe that will actually bring changes to these migrant workers, and also bring a benefit for them and also for the country. Because we do believe in a democratic world, we should prioritize the representation. We should prioritize how everyone's opinion is being heard by the government. Ladies and gentlemen, we do believe because of all these reasons, we should give the migrant workers right to vote, just because they deserve it, and also because we think that because of this right comes, hence the protection will come. And this oppressed, vulnerable group of the society will actually be heard, because in this world of the opposition, this opinion of this vulnerable group, this opinion of this smallest group of the society will never be heard, and there will be always oppression, because they are not protected by the law. With this, we close the case. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to invite the third speaker of the opposition to deliver their speech.
During their second speech, our side asked them a very important POI that read as follows. Does a vote matter if you aren't able to translate that vote into tangible policy outcomes? To which their response was one simple word: no. At the point where their third speaker reiterated that same line of argumentation that was said by their second speaker in response to our POI, why do we think that cost them the round? It's because they couch pretty much all of their offense on this principled idea that people have to have the right to vote because they've given up their labor to a country and deserve a say in democracy in return. But if they concede that their entire principled argument that they hang their case on is only good insofar as it results in tangible practical outcomes, if we prove to you that those outcomes do not occur, then they lose the round outright. in this speech a couple of things. First, I'll be going over the big strategic error made by the proposition, and then pose two questions that crystallize why we went around. The first, which side best protects migrant workers, and second, which side best protects the integrity of democracy. But let's first talk about the big strategic error made by the proposition. We gave to you a very nuanced third substantive argument that talked about how in a lot of cases vulnerable countries are susceptible to coercion by other more powerful countries as a result of the policy that they support. Their third speaker had the opportunity to engage us on this entire level of material, but they neglected to do so. Why do we think that that cost them the round? We think that our third substantive argument essentially deals with the most vulnerable economically and politically, most vulnerable economic and political populations in the entire world. And at the point where they say that it's those vulnerable populations that deserve the most protection, at the point where they don't engage with the argument that uniquely threaten those vulnerable actors, they can't win the round on a strategic standpoint. But going into the two major questions you ask yourself when evaluating the round. First, which side best protects migrant workers? This is where I want to spend the majority of my time, because this is really the only offense they have left in the debate at the point where they're conceded that their principle only relies on practical outcomes. So what was their practical outcome on why they protect migrant workers? They said that, well, you can cater policy to migrant workers in their second substantive, and their third substantive they say, well, the politicians have an incentive to get votes and are thus likely to care about migrant workers. Note that their third substantive argument is merely just a justification for their second, so I'm going to group them and attack them together. Let's respond to this idea that politicians have like this incentive to care about individuals. Emily told you three nuanced reasons as to why they won't tailor policies towards migrant workers that go completely unengaged with by their last speaker. Let's reiterate and extend them. We told you, first of all, politicians are susceptible to long-termist thinking. Why is this important? Because at the point where we told you that the vast majority of migrant workers are only in a certain country for a temporary period of time, and we prove that to you because their visas and green cards have expiration dates, we tell you that the likelihood that a politician is just going to care about them is very minimal. Because a politician cares about their long-term career, about maintaining a long-term voter base, not a temporary migrant voter base that doesn't necessarily account for them being elected in the future. What was the second reason why we told you why politicians are unlikely to cater to migrant workers? The sheer quantity of migrant workers in most countries is just not sufficient to get policymakers' attention. Why do you think this is the case? Just use their own example of the United States that they keep bringing up as justification for their argument. We already told you in a POI and in Emily's speech that has so far not gone engaged with, that already only 1 million migrant workers, not immigrants overall, but migrant workers, reside within a country like the United States. At the point where the United States has more than 300 million people, a politician is not going to care about 1/300th of a population, especially in a democracy when their only concern is to get a majority vote. But what was the third reason why we told you why politicians are not going to care about minority migrant worker interests? Again, that wasn't responded to. We told you in our third substantive argument about populist inertia that's taking root in a lot of countries. That was also analysis that we reiterated in our second substantive argument. We told you that at the point where a lot of countries where migrant workers are trying to get to in the first place have a lot of populist backlash when they try to enter, that means that they are unlikely to gain the traction and political capital that they need to influence tangible policy. Now, they acknowledged themselves in the first proposition speech that a lot of countries are plagued with racism and plagued with xenophobia. Yet they neglect to tell you why that will suddenly change, apart from saying, well, when more citizens who are migrant workers enter a country, they get more legitimacy. Let's attack this right now. We don't think that merely having more people, just having more migrant workers in a given country attack and giving them the right to vote makes them seem more legitimate. Why do we think this is the case? We think the mechanisms that we gave you internally that explain the incentives of politicians in our second substantive argument adequately deal with their argument. We tell you that what ends up happening is that a lot of people use the fact that migrant workers now have the right to vote to fuel their own populist rhetoric. Their argument is really an argument for our side of the house because we told you it fuels all the backlash, it fuels all the problems of repression against these migrant groups that they claim are so important because they're so vulnerable. However, uniquely important as to why repression is so problematic is because they're already the most vulnerable populations as they claim, and now they're subjecting them to more repression. In that world, they can't principally or practically support the migrant workers in their countries. But then they tell you that, well, the presence of more people decreases backlash, and giving non-citizens the right to vote makes them politically legitimate. Even if you believe them at their highest ground, we think there's a better alternative to getting individuals the right to vote. And what do we think that is? We already told you in Emily's speech that we would perfectly support things like maybe citizens voting because they have the unique incentives to care about the long-term improvement of the country that they're working in. What do we think then fulfills what's needed to vote? We gave you two arguments. First of all, we told you that migrant workers, or really anyone who has who should have the right to vote, has to have a vested interest in policy outcomes in the long term, but more importantly, second, they have to have a vested interest in the country's betterment in the long term. At the point where we told you that migrant workers just don't have those same incentives, there's no principled reasons to propose. Going on to the second clash point in this round, which side best supports the integrity of democracy? This is where their principle about democracy requires participation comes into play. I already told you why it's irrelevant by disproving their practical arguments, but say you don't buy that, I'll engage with it anyway. We think that the rhetoric that they used in their first proposition speech, where they told you that democracy requires participation, quote, by those who have a desire to control the conditions under which they live, is not upheld on their side of the house. Why? Because we told you that migrant workers do not have a desire to control the conditions under which they live, because they won't live there in the long term. Go.
What about those who live in the long term in that society? Why do you still choose to remain the vulnerable?
There's a difference between legal citizens who are immigrants living there in the long term and non-citizen migrant workers who we already established, given their short-term expiration dates on visas and green cards, won't be in the country in the long term. Those are the people who we don't think have a principled right to vote. But then what did we tell you on our side of the house? We told you that at the point where we say in our third substantive argument that really the allowance of all these migrant workers to vote in these other countries coerces those vulnerable countries, that means that they are more vulnerable to things like election meddling. Now, they themselves in their third speech conceded that some countries are actually reliant on migrant workers, and we think that those countries are particularly vulnerable to the problems that we outlined in our third substantive argument. It's the smaller, lesser developed countries like Ukraine, countries in sub-Saharan Africa, that other more powerful actors like Russia and China are easily able to take advantage of by flooding those countries with people, with specifically migrant workers, who on their side of the house have the right to vote and thus uncharacteristically influence politics towards their own interests because they are in the position of advantage in the power imbalances that exist between developed countries and more vulnerable ones. We think we are principally and practically ahead in this debate and protect the vulnerable migrant worker populations who deserve it the most. That's why we oppose.
Thank you. I would like to invite the speaker of the opposition to the
We were in complete agreement with side proposition that the right of a Mexican immigrant to escape drug cartels, to go to another country to get a job, to send money back to his children so they can do things like get an education and put food on the table is critically important. We also believed in the rights of people in countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo not to be extorted by other countries like China. We believe that both of these conditions get worse on side proposition's side of the House. We believe they were incredibly non-engaging with all of the nuanced analysis we brought you in today's round. We think we win today's debate. 2 questions in this speech. I'll try to speak over any buzzing. First, how does this affect migrants in larger countries with anti-immigrant sentiment? And second, how does this impact vulnerable nations? But first, how does this impact migrants in larger countries with anti-American sentiment? We told you that these are the countries where vulnerable immigrants are more likely to go to because there are many resources. We also told you these are the countries where more change needs to happen because policies are already incredibly discriminatory. We told you, their principle that they told you, they conceded throughout the round, was hung on them getting practical benefits, which means that they basically have 2 arguments left in this round, more like 1.5. The first is that when we increase representation for migrant workers and give them voting power, they can create change. And then second, if we give them votes, they'll be seen as politically legitimate. That second one was more of an assertion that didn't really get developed. We don't think it's particularly true, particularly for those who already view immigrants incredibly negatively. So let's focus on this first one. We gave you a ton of responses to this argument that received basically no engagement. We told you that there's an incredibly small incentive to cater to what they acknowledge is the vast minority of the population. So we think at best on their side of the house, they get basically no change at the point where literally 1 in 300 people in the United States is a migrant worker. We also told you that politicians like Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands already weaponize people's fear of migrants to get votes. They have every incentive to capitalize on every new additional reason to make people scared of migrants. You're scared of migrants because they're coming to take your job. Now you're scared of migrants because they're coming to take over your country. That rhetoric is very powerful for people already buying into this and is more likely to do things like garner support for policies to depress things like immigration quotas. We also told you politicians like Donald Trump, who know they're never ever going to get migrant votes, let's be real, have every incentive to also suppress their representation by decreasing these caps, which means that migrant workers from Mexico have fewer opportunities to economically advance, that migrant workers from all over the world reduce these opportunities. This was their entire offense, and now it is gone. And in fact, they make situations worse on their side of the house. They automatically lose today's round overwhelmingly on that question alone. But let's move on into the second question in this round. How does this impact vulnerable nations? They completely dropped our third substantive argument, which we're a little hurt by because Emily spent a lot of time developing it in her speech. We told you that smaller nations, particularly those reliant on larger coercive countries, are particularly vulnerable to this. This looks like countries like the DRC being economically reliant on China, or countries in the Balkans being politically and militarily pressured by Russia not to do things like limit immigration in these countries. So on their highest ground, if countries are going to be more receptive to increasing immigration policies and to the voices of these immigrants, it's going to lead to things like China and Russia flooding countries with friendly voters to do things like increase policies that allow China to brutally extract mineral resources in the DRC, to allow countries like the Balkans to have overwhelmingly pro-Russian leadership that acts against the interest of those countries. And even if you grant them that there are marginal improvements for quality of life for migrants in places like the United States, we think these vulnerable countries are even more important because there are far more people there and they're already the most vulnerable context. Overwhelmingly, we take this debate so proud to oppose.
Thank you. I would like to invite the replaced speaker of the proposition to end the debate.
In our mechanism, we thought that voting allows people to shift and change the political spectrum. We told you about this in our Prime Minister's speech, where he said that parties are not necessarily going to change policy and their approach towards the country, but rather they're going to shift how they approach this policy, right? They talk about the immigrant workers being a minority, right? We think that these politicians are actually going to change some things about their policies so that they can actually include those people, right? Which is something that we thought was important in this debate, right? We thought that this shifts the narrative and therefore shifts the discourse, right? We talked about how this is not happening in the status quo today. And our side opposition showed that they ignored minorities in this debate, right? Because they said migrant workers have a choice, and they rejected our argument that this is a dictatorship, right? But we still think that this is a dictatorship because these migrant workers are in existence. They're something that exists in all countries, right? Now, on their side of the house, they're simply telling us that migrant workers should not exist, therefore we should not be having this debate in the first place. And they also mentioned on their side of the house that migrant workers don't have the same principal right as natural citizens because they don't sacrifice much of their rights. But on our side of the house, we believe that these people, by living in this society, actually sacrifice just as much because society regulates how they live. And we told you this in our first speech. They felt that their existence on the political spectrum is going to be harmful to natural citizens, right? Where they talked about them not sacrificing just as much as the natural citizens. And we'd like to tell you that we resonated that their vote on the political stage is actually going to be about something that they care about, right? Not things that they talked about, like the policies that do not regard them. We literally say that these people are under the pressure of racism, xenophobia, bad working conditions in our first speech. They are more worried about these conditions rather than what they talked about on their side of the debate. Which is why we say that they are important, because they are vulnerable to harm, right? Yet to the side opposition of the House, the important parties of the House were the majority who have sacrificed something to get some principle right for being natural citizens in these places. Now, on this side of the House, they iterated the effects of long-term policies. But again, we say that the migrant workers are going to vote and promote the discourse on issues that concern them, right, rather than the issues that they talked about. They talked about immigrants taking over in countries like the Balkans or in Zimbabwe, where they talked about China actually manipulating the policies in this country. But yet this contradicts and proves a tension in their case, because they already say that these people are a minority in their country, therefore they don't have an effect on the policy. We believe that point held no water. Moreover, they talked about the effects and the clashes on the migrant workers, right? On our side of the House, we believe that giving these people voices is actually going to improve their lives, right? Because they are already facing these difficulties, right? We believe that people like Donald Trump are always going to exist, right? But our side of the House wanted to improve the status quo by bringing the opposition, by bringing the rest of the political spectrum to cater for the needs of these people, right? They only talked about the party that would benefit their side of the House the most, which is why we believe that on every situation we're going to be in this debate. Thank you.
This is the debate. I would like to ask the questions to the adjudicators and prosecution.
Oh, yes, sure. Sorry. All good.
So, we felt that there were principle and practical level to this on this debate. But first, we would just like to mention, let's say, a bit of a clash that happened in the beginning of the debate about long-term/short-term stay of the workers. We feel like in the end the opposition was able to prove us that since visa and green cards have expiration, those workers are of course there for short term, but we feel that you had a very good idea with new workers always coming in, replacing those workers that left, and that was a really good idea, and we are sad, let's say sad, that it only appeared in POI and was not further explored through the debate. It was a good point that could have made the entire clash even more interesting. Now, first on the principle level, we felt that opposition's examples of what gives citizens the right to vote, such as giving back to your country, to jury duty, paying taxes, and so on, were good examples that were explained good enough, but were not engaged well enough from the side of the proposition. So that principle level, we believe that there is a distinction between non-citizen workers and citizens, so that on principle level, that clash went on the side of opposition. Secondly, on the practical level, and will the voice of the workers actually be heard by politicians if they have a right to vote? We believe that opposition successfully showed in that manner that, well, there are three reasons. First, politicians want to listen to those, listen to the workers and what they have to say through their voting right, but also that there will be even backlash, which is something negative for the workers. So on that practical level, the clash also went on the side of opposition. The motion said local and national elections. I felt that if you explored more in the local part, where you could have easily proven that there are cities with majority of non-citizen migrant workers, their voice has to be heard, because they're majority. You could have won that clash on that matter, or at least explore it more in the debate. So just make sure you always look at every word in the motion, because every word is there for a reason. And thirdly, what we would just like to mention that opposition was also successful in putting their framing as countries with anti-migrant sentiment in the spotlight, and that worked actually very well in your favor. So it was also another thing that contributed to your win. I just want to say, maybe it sounds like they did everything perfectly because all of the clashes went on their side. It was not an easy debate. It was not like, oh yes, that went on off, that went on off, that went on off. Okay, it was an engaging and interesting debate. We just pointed out what were the main factors that created our decision. Okay, any questions? No.
Can we approach you for individual?
Yes, you can approach us all for individual. Congratulations again.